Hello, everyone. Welcome to um, summer school. Uh, Language Diversity, Module 3, Course 1, Language Diversity in Formal and Informal Settings. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about qualitative data coding and analysis. So let's first have a look at what is implied from language diversity, or what are the aspects of language diversity. When we talk about language diversity, usually one aspect would be context. As you can see in the title, two main contexts are formal versus informal settings. The other context could be schools and universities versus, for example, workplace context. And within any of these, actually, there would be and there could be lots of, micro contexts. The other aspect of language diversity is people. In any context, there are some people who converse with each other, who interact with each other by exchanging, language for particular purposes and gaining or doing some particular actions. And these people usually go through some processes. So one process, for example, is turn taking. By way of it, people take turns in order to, express themselves and convey meaning. And usually there are some outcomes from the, interactions among people using one or, several languages. These are some examples of different aspects of language diversity. You can think about some other, aspects, but these are just some examples. So what do we researchers do or want to do when we want to, investigate and study language diversity? Usually, we would like to study different contexts regarding people involved, as well as the processes that they go through, the outcomes that they achieve, and also the impacts of those outcomes on the decisions made and, processes they follow. So how do we investigate different, phenomena more broadly and generally? Language diversity is just one example of, a phenomenon that researchers actually face. So we do the investigation through systematic procedures based on some theoretical underpinnings that we call methods and methodology. In other words, in order for our procedures to be systematic, we need to have certain methodology and also following particular, methods. The theoretical philosophical underpinnings, which are usually epistemic, meaning that researchers look at phenomenon from different, perspectives, and therefore they have, an epistemic, perspective on what they are going to study. And this usually is dealt with in terms of research paradigms. Generally speaking, we know that researchers usually talk about three research paradigms. So one is positivism or post-positivism. And those who subscribe to positivism or post-positivism usually employ quantitative methodology in order to investigate, language phenomena. There is another paradigm which is called interpretivism, and this usually leads to qualitative methodology. So those who advocate interpretive, paradigm, they usually use qualitative methodology. And finally, the third theoretical underpinning or research paradigm is pragmatism, which researchers use mixed methods methodology, in that they try to mix both quantitative and qualitative methods in order to answer their research questions. So these relate to, theoretical underpinning, and usually researchers consciously or unconsciously, when they choose data sources and analytical procedures, they usually subscribe to one of these, three paradigms. On the other hand, systematic procedures or methods refer to the logistics of collecting and analyzing data. And different methods of data collection and analysis are usually in line with the epistemic foundations. So, for example, those who decide to do surveys and experiments, they use positivism or post-positivism quantitative methodology. And those who do case studies, mostly collecting qualitative data or ethnographies, usually they can be framed within an interpretive paradigm. Of course, as I mentioned, it might be possible that within a research project, we use both surveys as well as ethnographies and a combination of them, and using therefore a mixed methods approach. If you are interested, I refer you to my Encyclopedia of Research Methods in Applied Linguistics, published by Routledge, which includes key terms and concepts that you can find in that book related to the three research paradigms, as well as different methodology. So now let's move on. Since in this presentation, our focus is on qualitative data coding and analysis. So let's see what qualitative methodology, which belongs to an interpretive, research paradigm, is about. Qualitative research, as Denzin and Lincoln have stated, involves an interpretive, naturalistic approach to the world. So as you can see, it is linked to interpretive paradigm, and also it is naturalistic in the sense that there is no intervention, contrary to quantitative methodology that usually researchers intervene in the research. The definition implies that qualitative researchers study things in their natural settings, attempting to make sense of or to interpret phenomena in terms of the meanings people bring to them. So it's mostly about what participants or people think about or behave or react or reflect. So it's all about, investigating people's experiences. Qualitative research is a situated activity, so it is context embedded. Any phenomenon that's going to be studied needs to be studied within its own context that locates the observer in the world. It consists of a set of interpretive material practices that make the world visible and turn the world into a series of representations, including field notes, interviews, conversations, photographs, recordings, and memos to the self. So these are the type of methods that usually qualitative researchers use in order to collect their data. Okay, so basically we can say that in qualitative research, data sources include observations. Researchers are observers, and they can take either a participant or non-participant, observer role. And also interviews. Qualitative researchers usually interview participants in order to get their viewpoints and reflections. These interviews could be in the form of, it should be a structured, unstructured, or semi-structured, which you are familiar with or you can read about. Field notes are very important. As you observe as a researcher, you usually take field notes. These field notes could be taken in writing or orally, nowadays using a smartphone, and therefore recording your observations in addition to what you might systematically do in the observations. Documents in any research context, there are some documents that can help researchers, and therefore we might collect some of them that we have access to or we are permitted to collect. pictures, diaries, and journal logs, and other data sources, depending on the purpose of the study, as well as the context in which we collect data. Okay. Now that we know what data sources we usually collect with regard, for example, to language diversity in different contexts involving different people and processes, then the next question would be, how do we analyze qualitative data? Qualitative data analysis involves seeing and interpreting. So basically, the data, which we usually refer to as raw data, do not convey any particular, picture or pattern. And therefore, they are like, jigsaw puzzles that you have lots of, pieces, but there is no meaningful pattern unless you start to see and interpret and put them together. And so the pieces here refer to what has been said by participants, what has been written or done by participants, by focusing on the context, processes, and outcomes. Data analysis is usually done by reflecting on evolving codes and coding categories and inferring emergent themes and patterns. In other words, there is a movement from concrete, which is data, what we see and what we observe and what we have at hand, towards more abstract levels of meaning, which could be categories and themes and patterns. Coding is seen as the core element in qualitative data analysis, and through coding, qualitative researchers transform and, more importantly, transcend the data. Chalmers, who is a famous qualitative researcher, and she died recently, describes coding as the pivotal link between data collection and explaining the meaning of the data. So coding is very important in qualitative data analysis. And usually there are different approaches to doing the coding. Three outstanding approaches to qualitative data coding and analysis are thematic analysis, grounded theory, and content analysis. And therefore, familiarity with these approaches will enable you to become proficient in how to manage your data and how to analyze and how to make plausible inferences and conclusions from your data analysis. So it's very important to know about these three different approaches, their similarities and their differences, and in particular, the systematicity of using each approach is very important. In other words, if you are using thematic analysis, it's important to stick to a specific terminology using that, or in grounded theory and content analysis as well. When we talk about data analysis, qualitative data analysis, usually researchers think about three levels of analysis, and these three levels of analysis include coding, which is the basic step, and then after the coding is done, merging and categorizing codes into categories. And once you reduce the raw data into manageable number of categories, then finding a relationship between categories and extracting themes or patterns related to the research question and research problem. So there are three hierarchical levels in qualitative data analysis: codes, categories, and themes. Something that we need to think about as we discuss each individual approach to qualitative data coding and analysis. So the first approach is called thematic analysis. And thematic analysis can be done either inductively or deductively. Inductively means that you immerse yourself into data and then try to code each segment of the interviews, observations, documents, And then when you have done the coding of the data, you try to categorize them and then find the relationship between categories and extract one or two or three themes. So this is a sort of bottom-up approach, starting from data and then moving up to more abstract levels, which we call categories and themes. On the other hand, sometimes actually there are some available categories from the literature, previous research that you can apply to your data. So rather than immersing yourself to data in order to find codes and then categories and themes, you can use previous literature that has talked about some of these categories and use those categories in order to code your data. So this is called a top-down or deductive approach to thematic analysis, in that you benefit from previous research, theoretical and analytical frameworks in order to make sense of your data. So in the first approach, actually, we start from concrete, as I mentioned, data here. So we assign codes to pieces of data, and then we try to find the relationship between some codes and form subcategories, and then see how these subcategories might be related to each other and then form categories, and then finding a relationship between the categories and forming themes. Of course, there might or might not be subcategories depending again on data and research questions. But the important thing is that in inductive approach to thematic analysis, as I mentioned, it's a bottom-up approach. We start with the concrete data, and we move towards more abstract levels, which are categories and themes. The next approach is called grounded theory. Grounded theory, and by the way, I should say actually that some names are related, and you can find in the literature talking about these approaches. So in thematic analysis, Brown and Clark, and also Clark and Brown, because they have different publications, very nicely explain about thematic analysis, and I have put these in the reference that later on you can refer to. In grounded theory, the names that stand out for grounded theory are Glaser, Strauss, Corbin. These three people are the core names in grounded theory, but also people like Chalmers, as I mentioned, actually have contributed to the conceptualization of grounded theory. Like thematic analysis, grounded theory could be done through two techniques. One is called inductive, exactly the same as inductive thematic analysis. That is a bottom-up approach, but also abductive. And so here, instead of deductive, we have abductive. And actually, although Glaser and Strauss initially collaborated with each other to theorize grounded theory, but later on they departed from each other. Glaser stuck to inductive approach and believe that that's the essence of grounded theory, whereas Strauss and Corbin actually suggested an abductive approach. An abductive approach to qualitative data analysis believes that and the difference actually I can say is the place or the role of theory in research. Glaser believes that those who do grounded theory, they should not, involve any previous theory in their research. In other words, all is data is a famous, expression, and therefore they should stick to the data in order to do the coding and categorization and extracting themes. And then in the discussion, they can go and see what is discussed in previous research and other theories. But Strauss And Corbyn actually believed that no research can be or is able to be theoretical. So any one of us have some theoretical, backgrounds in our minds from the very beginning, and therefore what they suggest is that we should not deprive ourselves from those theories, and therefore from the very beginning we can think about how the data and the theory might interact with each other, and therefore they suggest that there should be a back and forth movement between data and theory, theory and data, and these two should interact with each other all through the process. There is a particular procedure called constant comparative analysis, which can be, represented differently from an inductive perspective and an abductive perspective. When constant comparative analysis is used in an inductive approach, then it means that you collect some data, you analyze it, and then you find some gaps. And therefore, again, you go for further data collection in order to fill those gaps. And this procedure continues based on a constant comparative analysis, analysis and comparison between the data and the inferences that you are going to make and themes that you are going to extract. And then you collect further data in order to fill those gaps. This is why in inductive approach to grounded theory, two key concepts, theoretical sampling and data saturation is usually used, which means that you continue collecting data until the new data does not give you any further information. When an abductive approach to qualitative data coding and analysis is used, the constant comparative analysis means the movement between data and theory. So this is the difference, that there is a back and forth movement between these two. The next approach is called content analysis. Again, content analysis is usually represented by three particular procedures. One is called conventional, exactly the same as inductive approach in grounded theory and in thematic analysis. So conventional means conventional approach in thematic analysis in grounded theory, and also it is a bottom-up approach, as I explained actually, and you are familiar now with. Directed approach, again, is exactly the same as a deductive approach or top-down approach in thematic analysis. It means when researchers have access to an already available coding scheme or categories and themes that they can apply to their data. There is a third approach to content analysis, which is called summative, and it could be a pure quantitative approach to qualitative data analysis, forming codes and categories and then coming up with some frequencies and percentages. However, it is recommended that qualitative researchers, even if they want to do those quantifications, do not stop at that level and go further and read between the lines and see what they can argue and provide as reasons, for the formation of those categories and themes. And so in summative content analysis, usually there is a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches. Okay, now that we got familiar with these three methods or approaches to qualitative data coding, I give you some tips. The first tip is that use this discussion as a guideline. You may find Miles and Huberman's and Saldana's, which is in the reference list, and Baisley's book or concept of a pragmatic realist position useful. What they say and what they recommend is that do not adhere slavishly to one school of thought or practice solely within the boundaries of one particular philosophical approach. As a PhD student or early career researcher, one of the contributions that you can have to research is methodological. So you might develop your own style of coding, and that's absolutely fine. as far as you are able to clearly explain and articulate, the process, but familiarity with other approaches is important for you to be able to make, that assertion. The next tip is that you need to decide on your approach to coding, whether your research, your topic, problem, questions lend themselves to inductive, deductive, or abductive, or any other approach in light of the purpose of your research and your research questions and your data sources. And remember that some qualitative research projects are already hypothesis driven. So if you think that you have some hypothesis that you want to check with your data, then that might require a more deductive or abductive approach rather than, inductive. And the final tip or strategy for you is to develop a code book. It's very important from the very beginning that you think about codes. You need to develop a coding scheme, and therefore you need to prepare the simplest actually way would be in Word to create a table with 3 columns. In the first column, you can put a code name and then give a name to your code. In the second one, give a description and a definition of the code. And in the third column, provide an example from your data so that you, understand your coding scheme. You will need to update and refer to it regularly because qualitative data is reiterative and recursive. It's not linear. You go to your data, go back and think about your coding scheme, revise it, again, apply it to your data. So your coding scheme, once drafted, needs to be updated regularly based on your observations and reflections. And it's very important to document the changes that you make to your codebook and provide a full account of your coding approach if you are going to write a thesis in the chapter of methodology, a paper in the methodology section of your paper, and so on and so forth. I hope that this brief presentation gives you some ideas about how to approach coding qualitative data and moving towards analysis. As I mentioned, I have provided some references for you related to this presentation and related to qualitative data and coding that I'm sure you will find useful in order to have a full-fledged understanding of how to manage your data and how to analyze your data. If you have any questions, I would be happy to respond to your questions. Thank you very much for your time and for your listening.